Numbers 23:22. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of an unicorn. Could the biblical unicorn be the rhinoceros? When looking up the word unicorn in the Webster's New World Dictionary, it says, unicorn, a mythical horse-like animal with a single horn growing from its forehead. This is what most of us think when we hear the word unicorn. We think of a horse with a horn growing out of its head. This is how unicorns are depicted in movies, cartoons, paintings, etc. Now this is not a real creature. This animal is totally fictitious. None of these are alive today, and no scientist has ever found a fossil one. However, unicorns are mentioned in the King James Version of the Bible 9 times, in 5 different books, by at least 5 different authors, by Balaam, Moses, David, Isaiah, and even God himself in the book of Job. These are the verses that mention unicorns. Deuteronomy 33:17. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns like the horns of a unicorn. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Psalm 22:21. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. Psalm 29:6. He maketh them also to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syrian like a young unicorn. Psalm 92:10. But my horn shalt thou exalt like the horn of a unicorn. I shall be anointed with fresh oil. Job 39:9. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Job 39:10. Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valley after thee? Wolpajete Conservancy in Kenya announced this week that their beloved 45-year-old white rhino died. His health worsened to a point that he was suffering and unable to walk. Officials there made the decision to euthanize the rhino. He had been suffering from age-related health issues and from a series of infections, Conservancy staff said in a statement. Once his condition significantly worsened and he was unable to stand up, and he was evidently suffering a great deal, the decision was to euthanize him was made by the veterinary team. Sudan was the last wild-caught northern white rhinoceros in captivity. The rhinoceros's death leaves only 2 of the northern white rhino subspecies alive on the planet. Najim, Sudan's daughter, born in 1989, and Fatu, Najim's daughter, born in 2000. Sudan was born around 1973 in South Sudan. At just a year or 2 of age, he was captured from the wild along with several other subspecies and taken to the Czechoslovakian Zoo. Czechoslovakia is known today as the Czech Republic. Captivity probably saved Sudan's life. Poaching became a rampant problem in Central Africa, the range of the northern white rhinoceros subspecies. In the 1970s and 1980s, according to conservation organization Save the Rhino, by the 1990s, only a few dozen northern white rhinos survived in Garamba National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Second Congo War in the late 1990s and early 2000s caused massive instability and human suffering in the country, leaving rhino conservation far on the back burner. According to Save the Rhino, militant groups took advantage of the rhinos at Garamba, poaching them and selling their horns on the black market to raise funds for fighting. The last documented sightings of the northern white rhinoceroses in the wild were in 2006. Rhino poaching has escalated in recent years. Today's value is $300,000 for the head of a rhino. This current demand is being driven by Asian countries, particularly Vietnam. It is used in traditional Chinese medicine, but more and more commonly now, it is used as a status symbol to display a person's success. As the northern white rhinoceros dwindled, its close relative, the southern white, was experiencing a resurgence. Down to fewer than 20 animals in the early 1900s, the southern white recovered thanks to conservation and managed hunting efforts, and there are now more than 20,000 of those rhinos in the wild. The modern definition of a unicorn: noun, unicorn, plural, noun, unicorn. A mythical animal typically represented as a horse with a single straight horn projecting from its forehead. Dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence. terms coined by Eugene Nida are two dissimilar biblical translation approaches, achieving different levels of literalness between the source text and the target text, as employed in biblical translation. The two have been understood basically, with one as sense for sense, translating the meanings of the phrases of the whole sentences, with readability in mind, and the other was word for word translation, translating the meaning of the words or phrases in a literal way, maintaining literal fidelity. Some would claim that the Bible is a book of fairy tales. It does, after all, mention unicorns. But the biblical unicorn was a real animal and not an imaginary creature. The Bible refers to the unicorn in the context of familiar animals, such as peacocks, lambs, lions, bullocks, goats, donkeys, horses, dogs, eagles, and calves. Job 39, 9-12. In Job 38:41, God reminded Job of the characteristics of a variety of impressive animals he had created, showing Job that God was far above man in power and strength. Job had to be familiar with the animals on God's list for the illustration to be effective. God points out in Job 39, 9-12, that the unicorn, whose strength is great, is useless for agricultural work, refusing to serve man or follow plow the valley. This visual aid gives Job a glimpse of God's greatness, an imaginary fantasy animal who had defeated the purpose of God's illustration. Modern readers have trouble with the Bible's unicorns because we forget that a single-horned creature is not uncommon on God's menu of animal design. Consider the rhinoceros and the narwhal. The Bible describes unicorns as skipping like calves, Psalm 29:6, traveling like bullocks, and bleeding when they die, Isaiah 34:7. The presence of a very strong horn on this powerful, independent-minded creature is intended to make readers think of great strength. Unicorns aren't mentioned in any of the modern translations. Only in the King James Version are they mentioned. Most of the translations say wild ox, while others use wild bull or buffalo, dynamic equivalents at work. Some versions take out the reference of any animal completely. Because of its use of the Textus Recepticus, the most inspired and preserved of all known manuscripts, the King James Version is the most accurate of all English translations. So because of this, some people, especially atheists, like to scoff at it and make fun of it as a book of myths and fairy tales. But it's important to understand that the definition of the word unicorn has changed over time. If you get an old 1828 Noah Webster's dictionary, which is the very first edition dictionary that Webster ever came out with over 200 years ago, and look up the word unicorn, it says, unicorn, an animal with one horn, the rhinoceros. This name is often applied to the rhinoceros. This 1828 dictionary can be accessed free online. Just go to google.com and type in Noah Webster 1828, and it will be one of the first links that pop up. Notice how this 200-year-old definition of the word unicorn says absolutely nothing about a horse. It says nothing about a horse-like animal, or a mythical animal, or a fictitious creature. It says absolutely nothing about mythology whatsoever, but rather it says that this is the name that is often applied to the rhinoceros. Now, anyone who has ever seen a rhinoceros knows that a rhino has two horns, a larger one up front and a smaller one behind. So how could a rhinoceros be considered a unicorn? Well, if you look up the word rhinoceros in the same dictionary, it says rhinoceros, a genus of quadrupeds of two species, one of which, the unicorn, has a single horn growing almost erect from the nose. This animal, when full grown, is said to be 12 feet in length. There is another species with two horns, the bicornis. They are natives of Asia and Africa. According to Noah Webster, back in the early 1800s, it was understood that there were two species of rhinoceros. The one-horned species was called unicorn, and the two-horned species was called bicornis. Today it is understood that there are 5 species of rhinoceros, 3 of which have 2 unicorns, and 2 of which have 1 horn. So basically, if you get a 200-year-old Noah Webster's dictionary and look up the word unicorn, it says rhinoceros. And if you look up the word rhinoceros, it says unicorn. That was just 200 years ago. The King James was translated over 400 years ago in 1611. One does not have to be a prolific mathematician to figure this out. Today's definition of the word unicorn says absolutely nothing about the rhinoceroses. And today's definition of the rhinoceros says absolutely nothing about unicorns. The definitions have changed over time. So if the definition of unicorn has changed in just the past 200 years from rhinoceros to horse, then it doesn't make much sense to take a modern definition of the word unicorn and apply it to a 400-year-old translation of the Bible. That's illogical. The original printing of the King James Version has this on its title page: newly translated out of the original tongues and with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment. The King James Version was translated from the original tongue, but the translators also diligently compared their work to former translations, including the Latin version. They would have known that the Latin said rhinoceros, but they put in unicorn. This is evidence that a unicorn meant rhinoceros back in 1611, just like it did in 1828. As a matter of fact, in Isaiah 34:7, in the original printing of the King James Version, when the word unicorn is used, there's a footnote that says, or rhinoceros. Isaiah 34:7. And the unicorn shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness. God's word is true and must be the standard in which we live and move and have our being. The use of dynamic equivalence disrupts that process by changing the biblical terms into sense for sense instead of word for word translation, just as God intends, depriving us of the ability to understand God's thoughts, to obey them. Psalm 6-7. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. Despite man's brutality and hatred for this beautiful, strong, and magnificent animal, Sudan is not the last unicorn, but sadly, the last of the species.